Isabella and Mikael, thank you so much, both of you, for the presentations you've given us. And I think that we have many reflections related to what you have communicated with us. But I would like, first of all, that you could reflect on each other. And I first ask you, Isabella, did you get any reflection when you heard what Mikael was saying?
Absolutely, I got many reflections. Well, on the concept of responsibility, and I think it's really worth contemplating what is responsibility and how do we define the very kind of concept of responsibility. And one reflection that I have is that we kind of tend to interpret it in a negative way, that it's kind of a burden to take responsibility. We would like to be free. We would like to be irresponsible. And I think that's a problem as well. I think when talking about the kind of interconnectedness of this world and of all people, I mean, we live in a global world now where the emissions here are affecting people on the other side of the planet and the other way around. We can't really kind of isolate ourselves and think that I just take responsibility for my kind of limited home where I can kind of relate. But we have to kind of raise to the reality that we are actually affecting the whole world, and it's all interconnected. And therefore, I think also I meet this a lot in climate debates. That is like the preconception is that it's kind of a burden to take this responsibility about the climate crisis. But I think we have to also change mindsets and really realize that it's an opportunity to take this responsibility, because we can do it. But everyone is kind of pointing fingers at each other and saying, well, you know, China, they're emitting much more than us, and the rich people are emitting much more than those, and therefore no one does anything. So that was one reflection. I'm not saying that you mean that it's something negative, but I'm curious what you think about that, because it's like the moral obligation. Yeah, it's something heavy, but it's also something liberating to kind of to do what you can do.
Absolutely, and perhaps I wasn't clear about it, but one of my arguments is also that taking responsibility is transforming the world from a space to a place, to my place. It becomes my place. That's the way I make a home, by taking responsibility. When my daughters grew up, I was, as a good father, trying to teach them to take responsibility, first of all, for their own trash. If there's any trash that you're responsible for, pick it up. And the next step is to expand your circle and also pick up trash that other people have left. And also to pick up bicycles that have fallen on the streets, for instance. And I don't think I was very successful, but that's another story. But I think that taking responsibility is also showing that this world is mine. So it's expanding your life world. But if I can reflect on some of the things that you said, I think that maybe the last point that you made sort of in the passing, but I think it's really important, the notion that all action actually stems from a feeling, you call it the oceanic feeling. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that the rational action is always based on something that is non-rational, not irrational, but non-rational. And so ethics and morality is, to me, basically a non-rational impulse. And I'm really interested in the source of that impulse. Where does it come from? And that is why I work at the Church of Sweden, not at the university, because I'm interested in the source, where that impulse comes from. And whether you talk about it in religious or secular terms, but there's an impulse that is essential for all action. Without that impulse, I think that real action is impossible. The same with responsibility. Responsibility must be born out of something else than an intellectual insight about my causing certain effects. It has also have to be grounded in something, I said, non-rational.
Would that also be a way to come away from the feeling that it's a burden?
Yes, I would say it's a gift rather than a burden.
Okay.
Yeah. To be given the privilege of assuming a responsibility, it means that I am responding to the world. Response and responsibility, same stem.
Good.
So it is responding to the world by considering the world, in a sense, my partner, my significant other. I can imagine that complete irresponsibility is also complete loneliness, isolation.
I like that, with responsibility being responding
Yes.
to the world, because I think also I think the idea you also talked about that we are co-creating this world, and which is kind of very exciting when you understand that you can do that, and you can kind of affect the world in different directions. But I think also it's a tough question, the one on where does it stem from, the kind of the will to do something good or morally good, which is what philosophers have tried to understand for a very, very long time. I like the quotation on Immanuel Kant's grave tomb, where he says two things that are kind of never continued, that continues to amaze me, is the starry sky above me and the moral law within. So where does it come from? But I think we all have it, but I think we also need to kind of have a little help from society at large to kind of develop it.
Absolutely.
I think there are many dimensions of this, what we are now talking as responsibility, because dependence and love is also sort of reason for taking responsibility for the ones that you relate to. So then it becomes a matter of how far does your scope of identifying yourself with, and then I think that the word dependence is important, because as soon as you know that this is not, I mean, as you say, it's not something that we can only deal with individually, because it's a collective problem. I mean, it's us together doing this, and it's us together having to change it. But when Malin told me the bright idea to have both of you starting this conference in one session, I was struck by the fact that you are coming from very different backgrounds. I had read your book, Mikael, a few years ago, when it came out, and I read your book a few weeks ago. And my strong feeling was that even though you talk sort of about different things, there is a very common trait between the two books. You, Mikael, you state that we have, in some sense, lost the feeling for what is sacred, lost the feeling for the mystical dimension of reality. And you, Isabella, when you talk about the ocean, actually the way you talk about it, for us who know David Thurfjell, who wrote the book Granskogs folk, is a book talking about nature becoming religion for people in Sweden. But the very notion that there is something bigger of which I am part is the same dimension as comes through in when you realize the sort of mystical dimension of reality that you write about. So do you, when I say that I see a strong link between the narratives, even if they are very different, do you understand me or don't you? What do you say?
Yeah, I definitely understand it. I don't think, I mean, I think that the insight that we're all connected and the awe that we're filled with is not a very, I mean, we do, with all due respect to both of us, not a very original insight. I mean, it's something that really, it's almost universal, that experience. But I think that the tricky question perhaps is, I mean, it's quite possible to feel that there's a meaning in this universe. It's a sacred place, everything is interconnected. The world has a meaning, life has a meaning, but my life does not have a meaning. It's absolutely, it's compatible to believe that life has a meaning without my own life having a meaning. And that this is, any narrative that excludes the individual, that excludes me, is not an existential narrative that I can live with. And that is the task, talking about new narratives, the need for a new narrative. It has to also include the individual on an individual basis, not just theoretically. Since 2017, depression is the main cause for ill health globally. And 2017 was a pretty good place to be. I mean, discarding all the problems that we grapple with at that time, but it was before the pandemic, before the war in the Ukraine. There were challenges and problems, sure, but it was a pretty good place to be. But at that very exact point, depression became the leading cause of ill health. Mm-hmm. So I think that an existential narrative really needs to include us on an individual level, and that is a very hard thing. That's a tricky thing, and for that I think that we need something else other than stories. We need rituals as part of this narrative.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a very broad question, but I think I mean that we need to change worldview is something that has become very, very clear to me. And that the worldview that we have now is outdated. It's based on Descartes, it's based on Freud, it's based on, even the ancient Greeks, where we kind of see the world as kind of, it's a very fragmented view, where you have everything can be analyzed in its smaller parts, and humans are outside of the material world, observing it. The whole science is kind of based on that. The scientific notion is based on that. But we already have new particle physics that shows us that that's not true. We are kind of affecting the results of whatever we're trying to observe. We're all part of it. It's not, the smaller parts you get into at the subatomic level, it's not parts anymore, it's patterns. It's energy. So basically science has already proven that we are energy patterns, and we're part of this whole creation. And you can find this religious kind of view or not, but I think it's very exciting. I think it's something that we need to take into our own self view, but also the world view that we are interconnected, and as long as we think that we are outside of nature, we're going to continue to abuse this planet. That's what I'm very convinced of. But I'm not, I don't belong to any church or religious current and so on, but I acknowledge that we need really to have these conversations a lot more. And I think also even religion or finding the meaning of life has become an individual quest in our society. So this is also kind of a burden for someone with existential thoughts. Oh my God, am I a Christian or maybe a Hindu or whatever? And you have to read all these books to understand that. So I agree with you. I mean, a little help with kind of what the society with rituals. I read your first book, and I think that's very interesting with your experience with Native Americans and
thanks.
And that. So, but so I'm just.
It's I mean, we're touching on very fundamental conceptions of reality when you say that we need a new world view, and I think sometimes we don't realize how determined we are by the context in which we have grown up. I have spent most of my time in education and in universities and stuff like that, and most of my life. And it took quite a long time for me to realize that everything that science have tried to do after the Enlightenment is actually about controlling nature, controlling resources, being able to draw resources from nature in a more effective way. And it struck me when I was moderating a conversation between Bishop Anders Arborelius and the Maori princess Irena Röse in a session we had at the foundation. Irena Röse is a Maori princess, but she lives in Sweden. And when I was preparing for that conversation, it struck me that what Maori Röse stands for, representing an indigenous community, is what I am trained to call as primitive. Because we see the world as the developed part of the world and the primitive, undeveloped part of the world. And of course, we have sort of integrated in our conceptual structures in our brains that the developed world is better than the undeveloped primitive world. And then again, when we look at it, I mean, you have studied the Lakota Indians a lot. You start with this quotation, Indian quotation.
Yes, I do, yeah.
When you start the book. So my question is, how, if it at all is possible, can we change these fundamental conceptions about what is primitive, what is developed, about what science is all about, and all these sort of big things that we have integrated in our own thinking? What can we do?
We can study anthropology to begin with. Because in anthropology it becomes absolutely clear that societies that were considered primitive in material sense were often very much advanced cosmologically, for instance. And kinship systems around the world. I mean, our kinship system and our rules for who you can marry and who you cannot marry are among the most primitive in the world. So we're extremely primitive when it comes to kinship systems and marriage rules, for instance, compared to, say, Aborigines in Australia, that have a much more advanced and much more complicated system for acknowledging relatives, for instance. So primitivity is not primitive is a lack of complexity. That is a definition of a primitive society, a society that lacks complexity. Is that a good or a bad thing? That's the first question we can ask. But in certain senses, our society is very primitive. In other ways, extremely complex. So I don't think it's possible to identify, in that sense, complex and primitive societies.
Well, I think our society is very complicated.
Complicated, yes.
But I don't know if it's very, well, we're kind of brutal in the way we see ourselves, our role and the outer world. While, thank you for reminding me, because that was one of the kind of brief encounters I had at a climate meeting in Madrid a few years ago. Greta Thunberg was there as well, and we had a meeting with Aboriginal people's groups, and it was a very brief meeting, but I took down the note because a leader chief from I don't now recall what tribe, but a Northern American, Native American tribe. And he just said to me, like in his introduction, he said, well, you think that you can own land or a lake or a tree, but we don't see it that way. We have relationships with nature, with the tree. We have a relationship with the lake. And that kind of stuck with me. And I think this notion of relationship comes back again and again when we're trying to define a meaningful world. That it's a world of relationships. It's not of objects. It's not about subjects and objects and owning the world. It's about what relationship do we have to each other and to animals and other species and the world at large. And I think that's a knowledge that many so-called, I wouldn't call them primitive, but I mean more Aboriginal people have preserved in a good sense. And every one of us can feel that connection, that relationship, if we have a cat at home. You know, if we're kind of on holidays at home and we don't have anything to do, so all of a sudden we start seeing, oh, that bird is coming again, and I never saw that before, and oh, it's a couple, and oh, they're living over there. Oh, they have a special sound when the cat comes. You know, and you start to kind of read the world, and you get, and then you see, okay, so now it's not afraid of me when I come, you know, and you start having a relationship. And this is, of course, comes very natural to those that live very close to nature. If you don't, if you live in a city, it's much more difficult. So it's a privilege to have all this access to nature that we have normally, many of us in this country. But I think you have to have some kind of a relationship to nature in order to want to protect it. If you don't, it's much more difficult. So I think one very, very practical thing we can do as decision makers or policy makers is to try to make nature accessible to young children, to schools, and to everyone. Just to have the basics of having that relationship. And I think I read in your book, the first book, I don't remember its name now.
I varje trumslag jordens puls.
Yes, it's about the drums and the pulse of the earth. But there was a quotation about God. Once, I think it was Bengt Nerman, someone told him that God is not kind of something that you believe in, but it's something you have a relationship to.
Yes.
And that changed everything for him.
Yes.
I thought that was interesting.
You remember that quote? That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
We shall open up for questions. It could be questions to one of the two speakers, but also for comments and reflections. So please, you can start there. And you get the microphone from Sofia so that we all can hear what you're saying.
Thank you so much for your talks and your conversation. I think you were getting into it now, Isabella. There is a gap in your speech. You start with a very personal experience from a very specific lake next to you where you grew up. And you end up writing to us here, be a proud human global citizen. And now you're saying also that children should have access to nature. And again, that to me it's a gap, because it's like nature is somewhere else, and in some way children should go out and visit or be exposed to nature. So I wonder if it doesn't come down to, it's a question also to Mikael, if it doesn't come down to the lack of place, that we are placeless, that a young person who is like hasn't ever grown a radish or a sunflower. I'm taking now the seeds that I know, but from experience are the most easy to, to grow. It will be very difficult to be a responsible global citizen if there isn't the space. It could be the schoolyard, that you put up a bit of the asphalt and you make, some for the children to grow. That if we don't have that this kind of global consciousness, I don't believe in that any longer. I understand it because I'm, an intellectual and I read and I'm exposed every morning, every day to the global, to the whole scene. But it seems to me that we have to get down to responsibility and what Stephen Jenkinson, who I will speak with tomorrow, calls village consciousness. That if we don't have village consciousness, then we will be a young person who is against eating animals and then eats acacia beans and cashews and all kind of strange diets that doesn't, do any benefit to the planet exactly, that he imports to his vegan cafes all over the world. So I'm wondering about this, that it gets burdensome and it gets very... it's a bit like the Christian church saying we should love humanity. I think it's very dangerous to say these things. We should be global, we should love humanity. We know that the people who are speaking about humanity usually are the worst, have been historically the worst perpetrators. Because, that's my question about the sense of place and how to foster that and how if or not that is possible today, and if or not, how can we go about? Because that seems to be, to me, the answer to taking responsibility, to have a place. Can't be responsible in general for humanity. I think Mikael doesn't think so either. No.
So, what do you say?
If I may, I think, thank you, Anita, for kind of bringing it down to kind of what is the real vision. As a green politician, I do believe in like the local society, that we have empowerment at a local level, that we can create communities, that we have reforms that actually allow for that you can own your own energy, you can grow your own food, that you have the kind of influence over your local community, which is, I think, something that gives a deeper meaning to many of us. It has its challenges, of course. It's very convenient to have everything served from above, but I think this is kind of where we can develop, many of us, in when we have more power over our daily lives and the way that we form that. But I think the global community, the global perspective, that was not very controversial like in the 1960s or 70s. We were all, I wasn't very much grown up then, but I mean, on global solidarity was something that everyone was agreeing was important, and the UN is based on all that. The Agenda 2030 is based on that we should all realize that the ecological, social, and economic sustainabilities are interconnected, and that no country on Earth can kind of, we can't, solve the climate crisis if we don't do it together. We can't solve peace on Earth unless we do it together, and we can't have global health and all that if rich countries are behaving irresponsibly towards poor countries. So I think, even if it's an abstract sense, I think we're all completely capable of understanding those interconnections. But we're not kind of doing it in daily politics, which is really sustaining all these problems, and they're growing. So I'm not sure if I got you right there on kind of that it's dangerous to talk about global solidarity and so on. In that case, I don't agree, because I think we know more than ever now, the interconnectedness of trade, of economics, of the physical climate, the ocean, everything is interconnected. So whether we like it or not, we will have to help each other and try to support the good forces all over if we're going to save ourselves.
Did you want to comment on
No,
that?
thanks.
No,
No,
okay.
thanks.
So we have the red third shirt there.
Thanks, everyone, for plunging us so quickly into the depths of climate existence. I want to take us back to something in your presentation, Isabella, because it's always very interesting to hear from people who've spent time at the highest level in politics once you're out the far side of carrying that responsibility and in a position to reflect on it. And you gave us those three explanations that aren't explanations for why we haven't been doing what needs to be done. I wanted to offer two other possibilities that I would be really interested to hear your reflections on. The first one is our systems and institutions are broken. And for me, what brought that home was in 2009, sitting in the office of the British Foreign Secretary and hearing him say to this group of us who'd been invited in, we know that the levers we use in foreign policy are broken, and we think that you guys might have some clues for us from some of the things that have been going on out on the internet. And for me, I realized as I walked out of that office that day that some part of me had assumed there were grown-ups up there who knew how it all worked and had their hands on levers, and when they pulled those levers, things happened. So that's my first one that I want to add to the list, is the problem that our systems and institutions are broken and the levers don't work? The second one is economic growth. When I was writing at work in the ruins, I had several very interesting conversations relating to this. One was with somebody who described what happened when Greta Thunberg met Emmanuel Macron, the French president, in 2019. And Macron apparently said to her, the reason why France can't reduce its emissions is our economic growth. A few months before that, I was in Brussels and I was contacted by someone working inside an organization close to the European institutions who wanted to speak to me because they had just completed a report on the future of shipping, where in order to explain how keeping the container ships coming from China could be made compatible with the goals for 2030, they had had to allocate 50% of Europe's entire projected green electricity supply in 2030 to producing the synthetic fuels to keep the container ships coming. And the problem this person had was they said to me, I know that in other offices in this city, people are writing reports for other sectors of the economy where they're making similar assumptions. And we are spending Europe's green electricity budget multiple times over in our stories of how it's all going to work to meet these goals by 2030, so that our bosses can go on not having to question the assumption of continued economic growth. And Jason Hickel and Georgios Kallis in their paper, Is Green Growth Possible?, after looking at the evidence, come to the conclusion that it's not politically acceptable to question economic growth. Therefore, green growth must be true since the alternative is disaster. So I'm just curious whether, going back to your reasons why we are not doing what we know we should be doing, having dismissed the three that you put up, from your experiences in those rooms, is it that our systems and institutions are broken and the levers don't work? Is it that questioning the economic growth assumption is unspeakable outside of private meetings with climate activists? Are those the real reasons why we see this gap between what we know and what's being done politically? I'm really curious what reflections you might have on that from your experience.
I think, can we have a couple of more inputs from the audience, and then you keep in mind what they've said. We had one before you then, and then a green shirt down. Please be as concise as you can.
Short and sweet. One term of clarification. Dorothy Lee was speaking with Mikael in the bus, used to say, learning from remote cultures, not primitive cultures. That's one way to deal with it. Then the answer is not on the self, which is isolated, autistic-like, but is the I that is related to others, the others in me and me in the others. And the third, last brief, I think there is an underlying emotional pathology, not Freudian, but pathology, which is hopelessness. It's globalized hopelessness. In that sense, Paulo Freire wrote The Pedagogy of Hope, because without hope, all the information goes to pot. So how to regain, and Mikael mentioned rituals. Okay, rituals. I will add something else, inspiration. And thank you for inspiring us today.
And then we have the green shirt down there, she's waving.
Thank you both for great talks and a great conversation. So I have a question about the relationship between individual responsibility and power and power structures. You did mention power and power structures, but what I'm interested in, I do agree with that we do need to take individual responsibility, but I'm also curious, because we've seen in the past that individual responsibility seems to be unequally divided, so that less privileged groups are seen as more individually responsible than more privileged groups. So my question is, how can we avoid that problem?
Who wants to go first?
Isabella.
Okay, I'll dive into the first question. So is it, I mean, thank you for suggesting these two other hypotheses on why we're not doing it. On the broken institutions, I would say no. In Sweden, in the European Union, we have, I mean, we're so privileged with all the civil servants, all the authorities, all the universities, everything that we have is incredible. I mean, if we just used it in the right way, we would have solved many problems, not every problem, but many, many problems. I think, however, what is a huge problem, and I mention it a lot in my book as well, is rather populism. And the problem is, I mean, we set up a fantastic system. I think the European Union is a miracle that we have 27, 28 countries that actually make laws together that are binding for an entire continent with 500 million people, which is the biggest market in the world, which is influencing all the other markets and everyone who's exporting. So we have enormous potential there. But I think I quote Jean-Claude Juncker, who was once the president of the European Union. He said, well, everyone knows what to do, but no one knows how to get re-elected after you've done it. So that's a problem. And I think, so, and that kind of connects back to our self-image and responsibility and our view of ourselves as citizens. Are we really taking our responsibility as citizens when we vote for politicians? Or are we just reacting like consumers? I'd like to have cheaper gas, and I'd like to have cheaper electricity, I'd like to have cheaper falukorv. Yeah, fine. Those that know Swedish know what I'm saying, but it's a certain sausage that was very much in the election campaign in Sweden last time. Or are we capable of thinking more long term when we go to elections? And are we capable of thinking in more complex terms? Because we live in a global world where we have global markets, global economy, global climate, global oceans. So the institutions are there, and it's a shame that we're not using them the way we should. And it's also very terrifying that there's a tendency of undermining democracy even in countries in Europe now. So it's something we need to, it's something very precious that we need to hold on to very, very much and defend, even if it's bureaucracy, even if we're tired of it, but it's the best system we have. I think that some kind of dictatorship would be a disaster, even if it was for kind of saving the planet, or, we have to all do it together. And green growth, of course. But I think we have to be honest about the notion of growth. It's not only about producing stuff. It's about also social security, it's about pensions, it's about hospitals, it's about schools. And I think the green movement has a tendency to just say, wow, away with growth. No, actually, there's good growth and there's bad growth, and we have to differ between those two. And I think if we want rails for trains, we want some bridges, we want stuff, and then we need steel, and then we have to we need to have steel plants for that, if we're going to build some buildings and stuff. So we have to do the green transition, even when it comes to steel, cement, and that will create growth. And I think that's good.
Time is almost up. There are big questions. The whole question of the challenges for democracy as a system are not easily dealt with in a very brief moment. But Mikael, a last word relating to what has been said by the audience, or something else, whatever.
Yeah, and there was this question about the individual responsibility. I'm not sure that I really got the complexity of your question, maybe. But talking about responsibility in the way that I do moral responsibility may sound very apolitical, sort of as an individual stance that you take in relation to the world. But to me, it's very important that it does not exclude or preclude the possibility of political action. On the contrary. But to me, taking responsibility seriously as an individual is also acknowledging the specificity of every person, of every individual. And that is a very important aspect of any resistance to modernity, because what modernity basically does is that it transforms anything specific into something general. For instance, value. Money erases all qualitative differences and makes everything translatable into something else. This is why we can use the same money to buy rainforest as for buying Coca-Cola Light, for instance. So money turns everything into shit in that sense. It decomposes everything. And also concepts like nature, like Anita pointed to. The concept of nature is a foreign concept in most cultures in the world. That the abstraction of nature out there. People have relationships to specific places, and they understand the world in terms of those relationships. It's like when it's Mother's Day, I send a card maybe, or give a phone call to my mother who's 95. I don't call every mother in the world. I call my mother because she's my mother, and through her motherhood I understand motherhood generally. So I would say that restoring the specificity of place, of the individual, of creation, of every specific place is, to me, a form of resistance, deep resistance to modernity. This is not a good answer to your question, but this is all the time that I had right now, so thank you.
All of us are searching for the path forward that we believe in, and I think that you have stimulated our thoughts at this start of the 2023 ClimateExistence Conference. Thank you so much, Isabella. Thank you so much, Mikael.
Thank you.